Welcome to the second Australasian Study of Parliament group meeting. It's lovely to see everybody here, thank you. I'm going to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the seminar is being held, the Wurundjeri and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Okay, look, today's seminar topic looks at the unique nature of Parliament as a workplace. That uniqueness and the major implications of its exceptionality is really what we're going to unpack this evening. To do that, we're indeed very fortunate to have three very distinguished speakers who will be bringing different skill sets to the conversation because of their various roles. The first panel member to speak is Dr. Vaughn Koops. Vaughn is the Deputy Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, and he's been a parliamentary officer for some 20 years, and over that time has fulfilled many important roles in terms of the Parliament. This evening, he will use his knowledge to help us better understand the Parliament and why it is an exceptional place in which to work. And if you want to add or subtract anything from that, Vaughn, please do. Vaughn will be followed by Associate Professor Amy Nethery from Deakin University, where she is a political sociologist and co-director of the Parliamentary Research Unit. Amy will be discussing whether MPs are always at work, whether the safety is now becoming an issue for members of Parliament in a way that it hadn't necessarily in the past, and whether the work done by MPs is actually valued by the community. And our third panel member is Dr. Tim Reid, who since 2018 has been the Legislative Assembly member for Brunswick. Prior to becoming a Member of Parliament, Tim was a physician and a National Health and Medical Research Council researcher. Tim will be talking about his own experiences over 8 years as a Member of Parliament, and will do so in the context of why cooperative relationships are important for the working of the Parliament and the challenges that members of Parliament face when trying to build such relationships. And again, if you want to add or subtract from that, Tim, please do. Each panel member will speak originally for about 10 minutes before I will be asking some questions, no doubt, and then I'll hand over to members in the audience. I also encourage the panel members, if they want to comment on anything another panel member has said, to agree or to disagree at a different perspective. We like these to be relaxed, informal and enjoyable occasions for people. I will remind people, though, that it's being recorded. And so anything that you ask or any question you ask or how you ask it will be out there for the world to see. Now, on that point, I'll now hand over to Vaughn. Thank you, Vaughn.
Thank you. Thank you. This is on. Fantastic. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose land we're meeting on and having the seminar from today, and elders and people from that community who might be present with us, or indeed any community that might watch online later. I was just going to cover a few observations, probably focusing on the singular and unique theme of the seminar about what makes principally probably the role of members singular and unique in this fairly strange and odd environment that we do Parliament from. And hopefully it will complement a little bit what Amy and Tim have to talk about too. And because I tend to waffle, if people want to just put up their hands, ask questions or interrupt, you're most welcome to along the way. So these are really just my observations. But one of them is that Members are, one of the things that makes it unique and special here is that members are appointed as individuals and have a remarkable amount of autonomy over what they do and how they do it as parliamentarians. So even though, technically members are often get into this place, or, the Houses of Parliament here in Victoria, as members of political parties, and the real foundation of the Westminster system of Parliament is that members are appointed by voters to their positions as individuals. And you can, so even when a party vote allocation gets a member into Parliament, once they're here as themselves, as a person, as Tim Reid, not as the Greens representative in the Assembly. And that's, and there are a few things that it becomes kind of obvious when it happens. A member leaves their party and becomes an independent. That's not a trigger for them to be thrown out of the Parliament. That's their choice, and they get to choose how they want to be a member for the period that it takes until the next election, until when they lose their seat. So a lot of what the foundation of Parliament really puts members at the centre of things as individuals, not as party representatives. Even though over the last number of decades it's evolved around a party system. So some of the things that happen in the Parliament that support that is that members are not interchangeable. You can see that in some of the structures and the traditions and the practices of Parliament. A member gives a notice of motion, it's in their name. It can't be transferred to another member, so it's an individual. It's not like it belongs to a party collectively. When a member is named, it's literally the person is named. They're no longer, Tim will never get named. But it wouldn't be the member for Brunswick getting named and thrown out of the chamber for a week or whatever it is. It would be Tim Reid, you're out. And that's how the motion is moved. So at key moments, and probably the foundation of the Parliament is that actually the people who are there on behalf of their constituents. They're not there as a party representative, they're there as an individual. And along with that goes an awful lot of autonomy. And members are empowered to represent their electorates with a unique amount of autonomy for a workplace. Probably most people here are aware, because you're all interested in Parliament, is that they carry with them parliamentary privilege, so they're able to do what they say in the House or in committees, can't be impeached or questioned in a court. That's a power and an autonomy that belongs to the member, where they get to choose. They have an awful lot of latitude to choose what is appropriate without constraint by other parties or forces. There might be social constraints, but really there's very few constraints in the parliamentary context, except for the own rules that it places on themselves. There are a few mechanisms for constraints on members that are legal and electoral. The legal ones set a pretty high bar for what's acceptable behaviour by members, which is fairly it's fairly unique as well. The Constitution Act talks about, if you get a criminal conviction of 5 years or more, you can't be a member. If you go bankrupt, you can't be a member. The Parliamentary Workplace Standards and Integrity Act now has mechanisms for complaints about not abiding with a code of conduct, but all the bars are very high, and even for things like that, even if it gets through an investigation, it still has to go through a process in the House for it to actually eventuate to many repercussions. So members get an awful lot of, a fairly singular and unique amount of autonomy to do what they want to do as they see fit. Another unique quality of members of Parliament is that they're in the public service, but they're not employees as such. So they're remunerated by the state, but they're not accountable to the state as an employee is to an employer, which is complicated. So they don't have managers, and except for in very limited circumstances, they can't be made to stand aside from where they are or give up their duties. They could be compelled socially, but if a member decides to ignore everyone and persist in what they want to do, very often they can do that. And that's fairly extraordinary. They sort of, and associated with that is another unique aspect is that members pretty much can choose how and when they work. Like, most members work an awful lot, and I think Amy's going to talk about that, and Tim could pretty easily talk about that. But, a member of the Assembly in Victoria could choose not to come to work for 4 years, send the Speaker a note every 9 sitting days saying, I don't want to come to work for this reason. Standing orders don't actually require a good reason, just a reason. And that's sort of, they can get away with that. And really the only mechanism to control that is the next election. And that's the rationale, is that if the voters don't like it, they can vote them out, but that's potentially up to 4 years away. So there's an extraordinary amount of autonomy and that an individual member can actually exercise over how they do their role and what they do. I'm already going too long, I'm sorry about that.
You're right, you've got another few minutes yet.
Yeah, sure. Probably a unique aspect of that is, there's very few controls. They can't be compelled to stand aside. You can't have someone come and talk to a member and force them to, not come to work today because you swore at someone, or that you've debated things too loudly to the wrong people. And I think that can create a real tension in the modern workplace in particular, where there's a reduced tolerance for confronting behaviours in the workplace, and an emphasis on people's perceptions of how they've received interactions from people rather than the intent of the person given the interaction. And I think that's it's a unique aspect of this workplace that we often kind of struggle to actually work around, between the relationship between staff, electorate officers and members. If a staff member acts inappropriately, we can tell them not to come into work today. But if a member acts inappropriately, there's relatively few triggers that can actually be pulled to bring that into line. The other thing I'll just mention before I totally run out of time is, which will hopefully segue a bit into what Amy's going to talk about, is members' unique role as legislators, scrutineers, parliamentarians and advocates. And it's, and I think probably a unique part of the role is that I'm not sure that anyone comes in ready to do it. It's really hard to think of anyone who would actually have all the tools in their basket to come in and be a member of parliament right off the bat. We have very specialised people in Office of Chief Parliamentary Counsel who draft legislation. It's very technical, it's very involved, and they spend their careers doing it. The role of a member is to understand how that legislation works, be able to critique it and amend it, all those kind of things. Like, people who work in that field don't know how to do that all the time. That's what a member's expected to do. People like clerks and parliamentary officers, I've been here like 20 plus years, I don't want to say how many plus that is, but we have very specialised knowledge about parliamentary procedure that members are also expected to be on top of, but really it's not realistic to expect them to do that. Scrutiny perhaps, if you came from a policy background, you might have some experience in scrutiny of policy or finances, but really it's very unlikely you'd have the full breadth of experience to cover all portfolios. And then the last thing is that the advocacy part of it, at a personal level, members have to work within their electorates with people who have got individual problems, who they also are expected to look after and attempt to fix those problems, or have the personal skills to be able to say, no, I can't help you with that problem. And so there's so many challenging aspects to that. I won't say there's any solution to it, I'm just saying it's very unique. Amy, do you want to?
Sure. Okay. That actually really does segue really nicely. Thanks so much, Vaughn. Hi, everyone. My name's Amy Nethery. I'm from Deakin University, and I just have to say, sitting here between these two, I'm not even suffering imposter syndrome. I actually am an imposter here. So, but it's terrific to be here.
Try getting elected.
No, I will not try, but thanks for the suggestion. I've got three, with this prompt for why Parliament is a unique workplace, I've come up with three ideas for why I think it is a particularly unique workplace. So we'll go through these. They do sort of run into each other, my three categories or my three arguments. The first one, as Vaughn preempted, is the idea that parliamentarians are always at work. So not only at work when they come to this beautiful building, but they work at their electorate offices, but they also at work when they're speaking to the media, whether that's at home on the phone or whether that's at a doorstop or at a TV studio. But they're also at work when they're in their community, when they're at a community dinner, when they're celebrating Eid with their community, when they're sizzling sausages at the local footy awards night. They're also at work when they're down their local supermarket buying milk. So MPs are always at work. That means they're always on in terms of location, but it also means that they're on in terms of timing. And as Vaughn also mentioned, it's an extraordinarily huge job. So yes, technically, and I'm sure that there are some MPs that do not show up to work. In fact, we know that there are some, and it can take it a little bit easier. I think the norm is that MPs will regularly work an 80-hour week or more. It's an overwhelming job. And so this is a job that takes over your life and requires an enormous amount of personal sacrifice in a way that not many roles do. So birthdays are missed, anniversaries are missed or cut short, and so that family life is really interrupted. I imagine, and I love your views, Tim, that sustaining such a workload over such a long period of time would make it very challenging for people to always be operating at their best, particularly when you've got a media that's there for a gotcha moment. So I don't know how you do it. And I also imagine that long-term, the impact, or we know that the impact on families, on relationships, but also physical and mental health is significant. So the always being at work is an issue. Before I close off this one, I just want to note that there's also sort of added gendered element to this. And I just wanted to note that, you know, it is still, even though parliaments are getting better at this, I think there's a lot of evidence to say that it is still particularly difficult to be a mother and have a parliamentary career as well, just because of the cultural notions around parenting that we still have in our society. Right, so that's the first one, parliamentarians always at work. The second one I wanted to mention is that I think parliamentarians are uniquely unsafe at work. And I think increasingly it is a career choice that is not necessarily a safe one. And that depends also on various things like gender and other personal identity markers. So the dehumanisation of MPs, I think, is not a new phenomenon. We as Australians have long held the view that someone who chooses to stand for Parliament must be fundamentally different from us in various ways. Maybe they're a narcissist, maybe they're morally corrupt, maybe they just love the spotlight, or otherwise there must be something different and unusual about them. As a nation, we love collecting at election nights, and if the outcome goes our particular way, seeing the demise of MPs from the other team, you know, like we do in a football match. But there's a particular sort of us and them, but also a particular sort of dehumanising element of that sport. This separation between us and them is exacerbated as our electorates grow. And so we've had this debate in Australia this year. The larger our communities, the larger the number of constituents that MPs serve, the more removed there are between us and MPs, and the more that this contributes to this sense that they are not like us. So therefore, we have that ongoing sort of sense of difference. Thrown into the mix, we have social media on which people can engage anonymously, and we have this situation where people feel empowered to harass and threaten or actively step outside the realms of social media and actively harm parliamentarians. Also, as you well know, we've got social media has facilitated the proliferation of politically motivated violence conducted by both lone actors and radical fringe groups. These include, we could name a whole long list of them, but anti-vax groups, sovereign citizens, and just the general run-of-the-mill misogynists. These are people whose identity is bound up to antagonistic relationship with government and whose commitment to that identity might override laws and respect for the individual rights of others. So we've got a situation in which we can see that parliamentarians, as part of their everyday job, are subjected to the sorts of behaviours and threats to their safety that people would not tolerate in any other workplace whatsoever. Should I pause?
Probably. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Well, not everywhere you go you get that background music, so Amy, as you were saying.
It's another aspect of the unique workplace, isn't it? Right, okay, so where was I? I was talking about safety. I've got a few stats here. I don't think I'll dwell on these because we know, anecdotally, we know that safety is increasing. And of course, I wanted to mention that, again, that there's a gendered aspect of that. If there are other identities that somebody shares, such as race, religion, age, physical ability and so forth, that even exacerbates it even more. We do know and we do hear that the safety of parliamentarians is a question that anecdotally is making young women in particular think twice about whether they want to pursue a career in politics, and that, I think, is very serious for our democracies. So that is something that we have to think through quite carefully in how to address that. Before I get off the topic of safety, and Vaughn, you really have sort of started talking about this as well. I want to note that that's not only external threats to people's safety, but there's also internal threats within parliaments. Bullying, we have had cases in Australia's parliaments of sexual assault and even rape. So there are processes in place and they are getting better all the time to deal with those sorts of things, but we also do have to acknowledge that there's cultures within some parliaments in Australia that have either in the past or still currently leave a bit to be desired in terms of health and safety. Right. So there were two of my things. Parliamentarians always being at work, and secondly, that it's a uniquely unsafe career to pursue. The third point that I wanted to make...
2 minutes.
Yep, this one's quick. Is that the work of parliamentarians is often not valued once they leave. So to start thinking about that, we have to first acknowledge that our democracies depend on a constant supply of new MPs entering Parliament with new energy, ideas and connections with their communities, and for those MPs not to stay too long. So the work of a parliamentarian is best thought of as a transient vocation. But because of the general community lack of understanding about what parliamentarians do, or perhaps even because of the antagonism towards MPs, when they leave Parliament, their skills and their capabilities are not always well understood and not well valued. So Vaughn talked about the idea that nobody comes to Parliament as a fully formed legislator, and there is a lot of learning to do on the job. That's often not well understood, not only by MPs themselves, but by possible future employers afterwards. And so that's a bit of a problem. Our research that we did at Deakin with former MPs from the Victorian Parliament, we heard that the most common experience of life after Parliament included a period, sometimes a long period, of unemployment and substantial ongoing underemployment. We heard that potential employers did not understand the breadth of skills that parliamentarians develop and use on the job, but also that they attributed characteristics such as the narcissism that I mentioned before, or the idea that MPs are not team players, and perhaps might eschew hard work for the spotlight. So we have a situation where in our studies, that several former MPs told me that their careers were on an outstanding trajectory before entering politics. That career was subsequently entirely derailed by their time in Parliament, and they would have been better off not standing before. So that is the third challenge and the third aspect of the unique aspect of Parliament. Unfortunately, that's a negative one to end on, but maybe, Tim, you can give us some more positive news.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Vaughn, too, for telling me even a couple of things I didn't know yet. So I might just give a little bit of a potted history of my time here. So I was elected at the end of 2018, and I didn't know on election night whether I'd been elected or not. In fact, it looked like I perhaps hadn't been. And so I went back to work in the clinic where I worked, which is part of the Alfred Hospital, and tried not to look at the VEC page updating every 15 minutes. And it was 10 days before the VEC declared my seat. I was pretty comfortable after 3 or 4 days, but it took that long. And so I thought, righto, that's it, I'm out of here. And my employer had already, on the Monday morning after the election, had cancelled my patients, somewhat optimistically perhaps. And so I wound up going to an introductory session for newly elected MPs run by Bridget here, the clerk, and I noticed I'd been paid by the hospital. And so the hospital had paid me for a fortnight, and Parliament started paying me from election day. And so there'd been a lot of scandals in the paper about MPs getting too much, and I wasn't sure whether this was allowed, me being paid by the Parliament and by the hospital simultaneously. I clearly couldn't have been doing both jobs at the same time, and I couldn't get either of them to take the money back. And I raise this because it's just to illustrate the unusual nature of the job and the employment relationship. The hospital said no. They and I had signed a contract and they were obliged to give me the money, and the clerk helpfully explained that it would be very difficult to do that here. So I worked out exactly how much money was involved and made a donation to the Alfred Hospital. And cleaned my conscience, and never ever got the expected phone call from the Herald Sun. So, wasted my time really, but so I wound up in an electorate office in Brunswick watching my predecessor's face sticker being peeled off the window, as mine will be this November, and wandering around, and there was kind of nothing there, and I sort of expected maybe there'd be some files with notes on helping constituents or something like that, but nothing, not a word. There was a sandwich maker, to which I remain indebted to, because that continues to be an important part of the electorate office. But so there really isn't a manual on how to be an MP. And I imagine it would be really challenging for an independent to go into this role without some guidance. It'd be really important to get advice from people who'd either worked with MPs or been MPs. And fortunately, being part of a party, small as it is, I was able to get that. The other thing that was fortunate from my perspective was that 5 Greens MPs had lost their seats at that election, thanks to Glenn Drury largely. And so there were a whole lot of Greens ex-staffers queuing at my door wanting jobs, and I was able to kind of pick the most highly recommended. And they then essentially managed me rather than the other way around for the first 6 months of my career. But again, I could see a role for a handbook for new MPs, but it can't be too prescriptive, because it really is up to us as to how we choose to use our time, and not just up to us, but up to our electorates. And so some of the MPs from other parties whom I've got to know, and I'll mention, I've been on the board of the public health promotion agency Vic Health with a Liberal MP and a Labor MP, and we've often found ourselves chatting. And Kathleen Matthews-Ward from Broadmeadows and I in Brunswick have there's a very different way in which our constituents use the electorate office. I get a steady stream of emails from experts giving me ideas as to what the government should do and why aren't we doing it immediately. Kathleen Matthews-Ward has, I think, a steady stream of people coming into her office wanting help for social problems. Now, I get a bit of that too, but not anywhere near the volume. In fact, my office was moved from a less visited part of Brunswick to a place with a lot of foot traffic right next to the Berkeley Square shopping centre. No difference to the number of people coming in the door. I was quite disappointed. We even tried opening on a Saturday morning and putting a sandwich board out and so on. People rarely come in. It's kind of a thrill when they do. People compete to be first to answer the door. So electorate, the way in which I think MPs interact with their constituents is actually going to differ depending on where you are, what are the interests and what are the needs of your constituents. And in an area that perhaps has more social need and social problems, it might be different to an area where, a lot of my voters have PhDs, excuse me, sucking on a cough lolly and so on, but, so it's an electorate by electorate proposition to some extent. And I might just comment briefly on safety. The electorate office seems terribly secure, almost obsessively secure with its locks and alarms and cameras and whatnot. But then all of a sudden we got a phone call from Anthony Albanese's office to say that someone had rung them, go figure, to say that they wanted to beat me up. And this was clearly, you can tell just from that this is a person who doesn't pay a lot of attention to politics, and that they were going through some personal strife, and we'd never met, and it was all to do with their own personal problems. But it was actually became a bit of a persistent problem, and we had to involve the fixated threat unit of the police force. And it all settled down after a period of time with nothing needing to be done. But so yes, there is a safety concern. I became grateful for the locks and alarms and cameras after all of that happened, having been somewhat dismissive of it in the start. But the other thing to point out, it's actually not just the MPs who are at risk. I think our staff, we have an allocation of 2.5 staff, and if you do the maths, if one or two are here with me in Parliament and there's just one left behind in the office, and I get nervous when there's a young woman as the only person in the office, and so, you know, we have certain rules about what we do there in terms of answering the door and that sort of thing. I just want to go back to my conversations with some of the other MPs, because I know this is something Colleen wanted to talk about. And having left medicine to become an MP, I thought, well, that's it. That's it for medicine. I won't need any more of that. And then COVID-19 appeared. And I found myself talking infectious diseases to West Brunswick, which was one of the first suburbs. Remember, there were about 4 suburbs that got locked down briefly. So I spent a lot of time dusting off my infectious disease knowledge, and then as lockdowns progressed and as COVID gradually dismantled our economic system and everything, you learn a lot about things when you take them to bits, including the economy. And I found myself talking more and more to the Health Minister's office. And we ended up having a very good relationship. It's never been that good before or since, with people stuck on the wrong side of borders or various other restrictions and so on. If you think about all the restrictions that applied, they were numerous and complex, but not nearly as complex as the society that they were trying to manage. And so there were always people stuck on the wrong side of them who were very deserving and needed ministerial intervention. And so we had a good relationship, and Martin Foley was the minister for most of that period. And then something happened which, again, hasn't happened before or since, which was the need to develop this pandemic legislation because Victoria had burned through too many 6-month cycles of extending the state of emergency. And I'm sorry if anyone's too traumatised for me to take you back to this period, but we needed this new legislation. And so the government knew they needed the Greens and Andy Medic from Animal Justice Party and Fiona Patton's votes to get it through. And so we had regular meetings with the Minister and presentations from barristers and so on about developing the legislation. I've never been involved in the development of legislation from just the beginning, which was a wish list, right through to its completion. And it's often occurred to me that there'd be lots of circumstances where this would be a good thing to do, and it was just those circumstances and, in my view, the foresight of that particular minister in thinking the only way to get people to commit to voting for something is to get them involved from the beginning. And so that was a really constructive and I found rewarding experience. And I was involved in that with Samantha Ratnam. But when the cookers marched outside with 3 nooses hanging up, there was one for each of the 3 upper house MPs whose votes were needed. It turned out to be 4. No one had done the maths. And Rod Barton was needed as well at the last minute. But there were just 3 nooses. And Samantha Ratnam and I were both negotiating in the public face from the Greens' point of view of this. But she got all the criticism. I didn't get any of it. In fact, Ellen Sandell, who'd had nothing to do with the negotiations at all, got more criticism than I did. And I couldn't help but feel that there was a gendered aspect to that. Why don't I stop there and leave time for questions?
Good. Well, thank you all very much. One thing from the 3 of you that's been going through my mind is the role too much for one person. And the other thing that I know the role is very complex, but it'd be one of the few workplaces where there are no key performance indicators. And that's been something that's actually been out there in the literature. So I'd just like your comments about, is the role too much for one person, therefore do we need to look at changing it in some way? And number two, what about some key performance indicators so no MP can decide not to come to work for 4 years if that's what they choose?
I'll start. I think it feels like too much for one person, especially if you're from a small party, but particularly if you're an independent. But I think if you're smart enough to get yourself elected, you should be smart enough to work out that you need to prioritise, and you can't do everything. In the previous parliament, we had 3 independents from rural and regional areas, and Ali Cupper from Mildura prioritised a small number of achievements, one of which was to return Mildura Hospital to public ownership, and she managed to get that done. Now, if the world was fair, she'd have been re-elected on that, but boundaries got redistributed, politics happened, and that wasn't the case. Nevertheless, I think she, as an independent who would be most vulnerable to being overwhelmed by the scale of the task. At least the 7 Greens can divide up the portfolios. I mean, we've got half a dozen each, but it's still, we can divide them up and share the workload. But an independent like Susanna Sheed from Shepparton or Ali Cupper from Mildura really has to say, okay, can't do everything. What are my top 3 things? And that's actually probably makes it a job that can be done. Performance indicators, why don't I hand over to someone else?
Yeah, look, I've got nothing to say on performance indicators to...
That's interesting in itself, isn't it?
It's a really interesting idea. But on whether the job is too much for one person, I was really interested to hear your views. I'm trying to write a paper at the moment about the idea of MPs job sharing. Remember that came up before the last federal election? I'm trying to think that through. So I think there is an argument to be made that it is too much for one person. But so is modern life in general, isn't it? But I think MPs is on steroids, if I can use that term.
Well, probably Tim's best place to judge whether it's too much for one person. I was talking about the range of skills that an idealised member would have. I don't think it's reasonable for anyone to have all of those skills, and I think that's possible. So, and the other thing that's sort of kind of unique about the job is the trust factor. I think members work in an environment where it's sometimes very hard to trust people, even from their own cohort, let alone others. And sort of as a parliamentary officer, you find that sometimes it can even be hard for us to convince a member to trust us because they're so used to holding their own information to themselves. And probably a good way to try and support members is to try and find a path to assure them that they will get good expert advice that they won't be compromised through. But I certainly think it's not possible for a member to do all this by themselves. It's possible if they had the right support. But I'm only talking about like the legislative and the parliament half of things. I mean, the pastoral element of caring for your electorate and your constituents, and like Tim said, it varies depending on where you might who you might happen to represent. But that's a whole. That's huge, and I'm not even sure where you'd go with that, and how you could possibly really resource members across all those fields.
KPIs?
KPIs. Look, it's a matter for the houses, isn't it? I think it's a matter for the parliament to determine. Like, really, if each house of parliament does have the power to discipline their own members, to make up constraints around what their members do, to eject them from the parliament if they want, they can form those rules. So it would really, like if there's a KPI, probably the houses should have a think about that. And then it can be a matter for debate, and they can put it up and they can have a discussion about it. I think simple things like how often you show up for work, it's arbitrary. It's kind of, who cares? I know there are plenty of wheel spinners in this world who show up and don't achieve much. I'm not sure MPs as a collective you would describe as wheel spinners. They tend to be people who get things done and work pretty hard. So, I'm not sure what the KPIs would be, and it's sort of, when we talk about the world of committees, and committees do an amazing amount of work and make an amazing, great recommendations that don't get picked up. We struggle with the same idea there. Well, what's a KPI for a committee that represents the views of its members, comes up with good recommendations that don't become policy or law? Does that mean the committee system is useless? No, it doesn't mean that. No. So I think KPIs is quite problematic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, one other quick question for everybody, then I'll go up to the floor. Do we need smaller electorates with less people in electorates? I know it'll be very difficult because people say, the last thing we need is more politicians. But realistically, do we actually need more politicians so that they're not handling 55,000 or more people and trying to do their parliamentary work and tend to their electorate? And, is it just a smaller electorates be advantageous to the democratic process and to the work of Parliament?
I'm going to leap in on that one and not answer your question. But one thing I didn't mention is part of the unique aspect of working in this parliamentary environment is that you get to know, me as a clerk or as a parliamentary officer gets to know members personally, not through the prism of the media or the representations to the general populace. We actually get to know members, who they are as people, and appreciate them regardless of their political views. You get to know them, and I think that sort of goes to the dehumanisation thing that Amy's been talking about. Is like, well, there's a nice aspect of that intimate relationship with people, and then members have it with ministers, and that's how they get things done as well from time to time. That if there's a way to capture that, and then people could get back to talking about the ideas behind policies and politics rather than focusing on the dehumanisation of the people who articulate those ideas. Maybe. I'm not sure if electorates fixes that.
It's fun. It's an interesting point you raised. Smaller electorates?
Yeah, I think there should be smaller electorates, and I think governments should be able to make that case and prosecute that case without too much trouble at all. So let's step up and have that conversation.
Maybe someone in the room knows, how long have we had 88 MPs in the lower house for? 1982. And so before that, we presumably had a smaller number.
65 up until mid-1970s.
Yeah. So the population growth since 1982 would have been substantial. And so I've got, 55,000 people in my electorate, give or take. It's a while since I've checked. And it's, 2.2 times bigger a problem at a federal level. They've got over 100,000 now. So for me, it's the number of emails. I think I'm trying to think about how important is the personal connection and the personal response between a constituent and an MP. A lot of what I get is the 17th email about an issue, which is pretty similar to the first. But then there are emails that are kind of unique to the area. Half of those are misconceptions. People think that I'm some sort of senior mayor. I get email. I got an email recently that said, "Can't you tell your councillors to do something more about the long grass, the weeds in my back lane?" As though I can crack a whip and local government will bend to my will. But there are problems that might be unique either to the geography where I am, or perhaps concerns that are common, like lots of apartments in Brunswick. Therefore, I'm going to be very concerned about owners' corporation politics. And I think indexing electorate size to population growth would make sense when you think about it like that. Certainly it's 82, so what is that, 44 years? It's probably time, isn't it?
It's something that academics might like to take up and promote. Look, we've got time for a couple of questions from the floor. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question? Yes, certainly.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Patrick from the council committees. I just wanted to raise the issue of autonomy and then how you balance that with the party discipline. And Australia has always said to have the strictest party discipline. When the Teals mentioned last week forming a party, all their voters said no, we don't want that. The reason we voted for you is because you're not in a party. So how do you balance that autonomy with the party discipline and the need to speak with one voice, essentially, as a member of a party?
I guess as a member of a party I should. So I think different parties have a different approach to party discipline or solidarity, and particularly to crossing the floor. And I'm no more expert than you, but I think that the Liberal Party has historically been a little more tolerant of crossing the floor than the Labor Party, which generally would see that as an offence that might mean you don't get pre-selected next time. I don't think that's absolute, but certainly I've never seen anyone cross the floor in my 2 terms. The Greens have a process whereby one of us has to notify that if I'm thinking of crossing the floor, I have to tell the party room in advance, and there has to be a meeting where we discuss it, and the party has an opportunity to change my mind or not, and then it's allowed. But as I say, I've never seen it happen in any of the parties in my time. So discipline or consensus, depending on which side of the coin it is, it has been pretty strong. And you'd have to expect, I think it'd be fair to assume that when people vote as a bloc, quite often there'll be 1 or 2 people who, given free rein, might have voted a different way. And it'd be fascinating to see what would happen in those circumstances. And we see it, I've only seen it in the recent voluntary assisted dying debate, and that was interesting. But I think that it's very hard to see a party system functioning without a degree of discipline. Otherwise, it ceases to be a party. You lose what you gain from having a party. I mean, ideally we'd have more independence in the chamber. It would be great to have a bunch of independents who were persuaded by the argument in the chamber as opposed to the arguments in their own party room or caucus meetings.
Okay, we've got time for one more quick question, please, Julia. Yeah.
Vaughn, I was really interested in the way that you started out talking about effectively the ungovernability of MPs, and it sort of chimes in a bit with that question, because if you've got political parties, they are also kind of exempt from the rules of governability. Even though they're part of the public sphere, they're not really of the public sphere, and that's because they're private organisations. And I'm just wondering, if there's some kind of trace notion that kind of goes back in culture about the nature of privacy, certainly as it applies to organisations and private organisations all over the place, you know what they look like. But I'm wondering if there's a sort of historic notion of the MP as a sort of private subject and therefore unable to be governed.
Vaughn, what do you think?
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting thing to wonder, because I was wondering it too while I was thinking about this, because even technically members can do whatever they want, but the party system is fairly dominant and it does work and it does have outcomes that suit. Yeah, and it does effectively govern members and what they do as well. In terms of, when I was thinking about how unique is the role of an MP, part of me is, that's why I put in the bit about in the public sector, because I was thinking, well, actually, in some ways, like an MP is like a small business owner. You know, they, like small business owners, can run their own show as well, and in a way, maybe that's more of an analogy to how members operate as well. And if you look at the origin of the parliaments, it was individuals elected to parliaments. The party system evolved from that, but even in Victoria, for the first however many couple of decades, it was really just a bunch of individuals representing their electorates. So that's what I was sort of meaning by the foundations are about the individual. In some ways, technically, those foundations haven't changed, but the practices have definitely are solidly in the party discipline camp.
Does either Amy or Tim want to add anything to that?
Local government is slightly different in that you have to approach, so councillors, no matter what parties they might be members of, are all governing. So here, it's just the Labor MPs in this case, in the lower house, who are in the government, and the rest of us carry on, but we don't have any real decision-making power. But on council, it's different. They're all governing, unless there's a consistent ruling bloc, which there often isn't. But they're required to. There was a court decision called the Winky Pop decision, which I don't fully understand, which means that they're not allowed to express a view about how they will vote on a matter. I'm not sure if I'm giving it a fair description, and there might be others in the room who have a better understanding, but so under the Winky Pop decision, you can't say, I will oppose that development on the corner of Lygon Street and Glen Lyon Road. You've got to say something a bit different to that, and which doesn't presuppose how you're going to vote, and you have to make up your mind on the day. And so the party system doesn't has to work around that a bit in local government.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up very soon. Do you want to say something, Vaughn? Amy? No? Okay. Well, look, it only leaves me to say thank you very much to our three speakers. That was such a wonderful conversation, and I actually do have about another 20 questions, but I'm sure people need to go and do other things. But please join me in thanking our three speakers.